The knock on the carriage door came too fast, and Clara Bennett knew before she opened it that something was wrong. Two men stood in the rain, their coats soaked through, their faces lit by a lantern that shook in the wind. They were not friendly men. They worked for the moneylender who had taken everything her father owned, and now they had come for her. "You have a debt to pay," the taller one said. "Your father is gone. That leaves you." Clara stepped back into the carriage, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it over the storm. She had no money. She had nothing but a letter in her pocket, one she had received 3 days earlier from a household far to the north, offering a position as a maid to a lord who lived alone. She had planned to think it over. Now there was no time to think. "I am leaving tonight," she said, and before the men could stop her, she pushed past them and ran through the rain toward the mail coach, waiting at the end of the lane. The driver barely had time to close the door before the horses moved. Clara pressed herself against the seat and did not look back, though she heard shouting behind her, fading into the storm. By the time the coach reached the edge of the countryside estate known as Ashwood, the rain had turned to a fine mist that clung to the hills like a secret. Clara stepped down from the coach with her single bag and looked up at the house. It was enormous, built of gray stone, with dark windows that seemed to watch her rather than welcome her. A single light burned on the highest floor. An older woman met her at the door. She introduced herself as Mrs. Whitfield, the housekeeper, and looked Clara over with sharp eyes before nodding once. "You are punctual at least," Mrs. Whitfield said. "Come in before you catch your death." Inside, the house was warm, but strangely quiet, as though sound itself had been asked to leave. Clara followed Mrs. Whitfield down a long hallway lined with paintings, though none of them showed faces. Landscapes, ships, empty gardens, not a single portrait of a person. "You will have 3 duties," Mrs. Whitfield said as they walked. "You will clean the east wing. You will help in the kitchen. And twice a day, you will bring meals to the study of Lord Ashford." "And the west wing?" Clara asked, because she had noticed a heavy door at the end of the hall, bolted twice over. Mrs. Whitfield stopped walking. For a moment her sharp eyes softened into something like fear. "You do not go there," she said. "Not for any reason. Not even if you hear something. Do you understand me?" Clara nodded, though she did not understand at all. She wanted to ask what could possibly be behind a locked door in an empty house that would frighten a woman like Mrs. Whitfield, who did not seem the type to frighten easily. But something in the housekeeper's face told her this was not a question to ask on her first night. Her room was small but clean, tucked under the roof at the end of a narrow staircase. Clara set down her bag and sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the house settle around her. She had escaped one danger, only to walk into a house full of locked doors and silent portraits. She told herself it was only a job. She told herself she would work, save her wages, and leave within the year. She did not sleep well that first night. Sometime after midnight, she woke to a sound she could not place at first, a low murmur coming from somewhere below her room. She lay still, listening, until she realized it was a voice. A man's voice, speaking steadily, as though carrying on a conversation. But there was no answering voice, only his, rising and falling in the dark house, speaking to someone who was not there. Clara pulled her blanket to her chin and stared at the ceiling until the voice finally stopped. She told herself it was nothing. A man alone in a big house might talk to himself. It did not have to mean anything more than that. In the morning, Mrs. Whitfield handed her a tray covered with a silver lid and told her to bring it to the study at the end of the west corridor, the one corridor that was not part of the locked wing. Clara carried the tray carefully, her footsteps echoing on the polished floor, until she reached a heavy wooden door. She knocked once. "Leave it outside," a voice said. It was deep and quiet, but there was something guarded in it, as if the man behind the door was used to keeping people away. "I was told to bring it in, my lord," Clara said, because Mrs. Whitfield had been very clear about that part. There was a long pause. Then the door opened, just enough for her to see a sliver of the room inside, and a hand reached out to take the tray from her. She caught only a glimpse of a sleeve, dark green wool, and a ring on one finger, before the door closed again. "Thank you," the voice said through the wood. "That will be all." Clara stood there a moment longer than she should have, staring at the closed door. She had come all this way, run from men who wanted to collect a debt with her body if not her money, and here she was, serving a man she was not permitted to see. That evening, as she carried the second tray, she heard the voice again before she reached the door, the same low murmur she had heard in the night. She stopped several feet away and listened, though she knew she should not. The words were too soft to make out, but the tone was unmistakable. He was speaking as though someone stood across from him, as though someone was listening. She knocked, and the voice stopped at once. "Leave it outside," he said again, sharper this time. Clara set the tray down and hurried away, her pulse quick in her throat. Halfway down the corridor, she glanced back and saw the study door open just a crack, a single eye watching her retreat into the dark hallway. She did not slow her steps until she reached the kitchen, where Mrs. Whitfield was waiting, with a look that told Clara she already knew what had happened. "He does that," Mrs. Whitfield said simply, stirring a pot on the stove without looking up. "Talks to no one, watches everyone. It is not your place to ask why." "Is he dangerous?" Clara asked, because she needed to know if she had traded one danger for another. Mrs. Whitfield was quiet for a long moment. "No," she said finally. "He has never harmed a soul in this house. But he is a man carrying something heavy, and heavy things make people strange. You would do well to keep your questions to yourself, and your eyes on your work." Clara tried to take the advice. For the next several days, she cleaned the east wing, scrubbed floors in the kitchen, and carried trays to a door that never fully opened. She grew used to the rhythm of the house, the silence that filled every room, except the one where the Lord spoke to no one. She grew used to the servants who flinched whenever the west wing was mentioned, and to the strange kindnesses that appeared without explanation. A fire lit in her room on the coldest nights. A warning slipped under her door before a storm rolled in, telling her not to walk the outer path the next morning, though she had never told anyone she meant to. She began to wonder how a man who never left his study could know these things. How he could know the weather before it came, or that she was cold at night, when he had never once looked at her directly. One evening, as she cleared the tray from his door, she found a note tucked beneath the plate. It was short, written in careful handwriting. "You need not fear the men who came for you. They will not find you here." Clara stood frozen in the hallway, the note trembling in her hand. She had told no one about the men at the carriage, about the debt, about the reason she had left in such haste. She had told no one, and yet he knew. She looked at the closed door, her heart racing with a mixture of fear and something else, something she did not yet have a name for. Somewhere behind that door was a man who watched over a house full of secrets, who spoke to empty rooms, who knew things he should not know, and who had just told her, in his own quiet way, that she was safe. She folded the note and put it in her pocket, next to the letter that had brought her to Ashwood in the first place. Whatever waited for her behind that locked door in the west wing, whatever secret made grown servants flinch and a lord hide his own face, Clara knew now that she was not going to leave without finding out. Not anymore. The house had already pulled her too far in, and there was no path left that led away from it, only one that led further inside, toward whatever truth was waiting behind the silence. That night, she lay awake long after the house had gone quiet, staring at the ceiling and listening for the voice that spoke to no one. It did not come. Instead, she heard something new. Footsteps in the hallway outside her door, slow and careful, pausing just outside before moving on. She did not open her door to look. She only listened, her breath held tight in her chest, until the footsteps faded into the far end of the house, toward the corridor that led, she was almost certain, to the locked door of the west wing. The scream came from the kitchen just before dawn, sharp enough to pull Clara out of bed before she was even fully awake. She ran down the narrow staircase with her heart slamming against her ribs, following the sound to find the young kitchen girl, Nora, standing frozen by the back door, staring at a broken window and a muddy footprint on the stone floor. "Someone was here," Nora whispered. "Someone tried to get in." Mrs. Whitfield arrived moments later, wrapped in a shawl, her face pale in the lamplight. She examined the broken glass without a word, then knelt to study the footprint, pressing her lips into a thin line. "Lock every door," she said at last. "Every window. I will inform his lordship." Clara helped Nora sweep the glass, her hands unsteady, her mind circling back to the footsteps she had heard the night before, pausing just outside her door before moving toward the west wing. She had told herself it was nothing. Now she was not so sure. By midday, The household had returned to its usual quiet, though the fear lingered under the surface like smoke that refused to clear. Clara carried the noon tray to the study, as she always did, but this time, before she could knock, the door opened on its own. Lord Ashford stood in the doorway, half turned away so she could not see his face clearly, only the strong line of his jaw and the dark hair that fell across his brow. He wore his sleeve rolled back on one arm, and Clara noticed a fresh cut across his forearm, still raw. "You heard the scream this morning," he said. It was not a question. "Yes, my lord." "Someone tried to force their way into this house last night," he said. "I want you to understand that you are not the reason they came, and you are not in danger from me. But you may be in danger because of who I am. If you wish to leave, I will arrange safe passage for you today, with a full year's wages." Clara stood very still, surprised by the offer, and even more surprised by how quickly she shook her head. "I have nowhere else to go, my lord," she said. "And I would rather stay and understand what is happening than run again." Something shifted in his stance, though she could not read his expression from the angle he kept turned from her. "You are either very brave," he said quietly, "or very foolish." "Perhaps both," Clara answered, and for a moment she thought she heard something close to a laugh, quickly swallowed. He closed the door before she could see more of his face, but that afternoon, she found herself thinking of his voice more than she wanted to admit. There was a loneliness in it that matched something inside her own chest, a loneliness she recognized because she carried it too. 2 days passed without incident, though the staff remained watchful, checking locks twice over and startling at every unfamiliar sound. Clara took to sleeping with a chair pushed against her door, though she could not have said what she thought a chair would do against whoever had tried to break in. It was on the 3rd night that she found the letter. She had gone down to the kitchen for a cup of water when she noticed a folded paper tucked half beneath the pantry door, as though someone had dropped it in haste. She picked it up without thinking, and the moment she read the first line, her stomach turned cold. "The girl is a complication. Remove her from the house before the next visit, or we will remove her ourselves." There was no signature, only a wax seal stamped with the image of a hawk, its wings spread wide. Clara's hands shook as she read the words again, trying to understand who had written them and who they were meant for. The girl. She did not know if the letter spoke of her or of someone else entirely, but the chill in her chest told her she already suspected the answer. She should have brought the letter straight to Mrs. Whitfield. Instead, driven by something she could not name, she carried it to the study door and knocked, harder than she meant to. The door opened at once, as though he had been waiting just behind it. "What is it?" Lord Ashford asked, his voice sharp with concern rather than anger. Clara held out the letter with a trembling hand. He took it, and for the first time, stepped fully into the light of the hallway to read it. Clara saw his face clearly then, strong-featured, marked by a thin scar along one cheekbone, his eyes a deep and troubled gray. He was not what she had expected. He looked younger than the weight of his voice had suggested, and far more afraid. "Where did you find this?" he said, his voice suddenly hard. "By the pantry door. I don't know who dropped it or who left it there." He read the letter twice, his jaw tightening with every line. "The girl," he repeated softly, almost to himself. "They mean you." "Why would anyone want me removed from this house?" Clara asked. "I am no one. I have been here a matter of days." "Because you have seen my face," he said, folding the letter carefully. "Because you carry my meals, and hear my voice, and know that I exist behind this door, alive and unguarded. There are men who would prefer the world believe I do not exist at all." Clara's mind raced through everything she had witnessed since arriving at Ashwood, the locked wing, the empty portraits, the fear in Mrs. Whitfield's eyes whenever the West Corridor was mentioned, pieces that did not yet form a whole picture, but were beginning, slowly, to suggest one. "Who are you?" she asked, "that men would send letters like this over a servant girl seeing your face?" He studied her for a long moment, his gray eyes searching hers as though weighing how much truth she could carry. "Someone I cannot yet tell you," he said finally. "Not because I do not trust you, but because the less you know, the safer you remain. I am sorry for that. I am sorry for all of it." He asked her to stay close to Mrs. Whitfield for the following days, to avoid the outer paths, and to tell him immediately, if she noticed anyone near the house who did not belong there. Clara agreed, though the fear in her chest had shifted into something else entirely, a fierce and stubborn curiosity that refused to let her walk away now, even with the offer of a year's wages and a safe departure still sitting unclaimed. That night, sleep would not come. She lay in the dark, listening to the wind against her window, until she heard something that made her sit upright at once, a soft scrape of metal against wood, coming from somewhere below. She crept to her door and opened it just enough to look down the narrow staircase. A shape moved through the hallway below, low and quick, avoiding the lit lamps along the wall. Clara's breath caught in her throat. It was not Mrs. Whitfield, not Nora, not any of the household staff she recognized by their careful, familiar steps. This figure moved like someone who did not want to be seen, heading straight toward the locked door of the west wing. Clara knew she should call for help. She knew she should wake the house and let the danger be handled by someone stronger and more prepared than a maid in a nightgown. But something pulled her forward instead, down the staircase, her bare feet silent on the cold floor, following the shadow that slipped through the dark like it belonged there. She reached the end of the hallway just as the figure pressed something against the heavy lock of the west wing door, a thin tool that caught the moonlight from the window. Clara opened her mouth to shout, but before a single sound escaped her, a hand closed firmly over her wrist from behind, pulling her back into the shadow of an alcove. "Do not make a sound," Lord Ashford whispered against her ear, his voice barely audible. "Not yet." Clara's heart pounded so loudly she was certain the intruder would hear it from across the hall. She turned her head slightly and saw Lord Ashford's face close to hers, tense and focused, his eyes fixed on the figure at the door. He held something in his other hand, a short blade that caught the moonlight the same way the intruder's tool had, and for the first time since she had arrived at Ashwood, Clara understood that whatever secret lived behind that locked door, it was worth more to some men than a human life. The intruder froze at the sound of the lock finally giving way, the heavy door creaking open an inch into darkness, and in that single, suspended moment, Clara realized that whoever had come to Ashwood that night was not searching for anything hidden inside the West Wing. They were searching for someone. The door swung open fully, and the intruder stepped through into the darkness of the West Wing without hesitation, as though he had walked that path before. Lord Ashford moved so quickly that Clara barely saw him cross the hallway. He caught the man from behind, one arm locked across his chest, the blade pressed flat against his throat, not cutting, but promising that it could. "Who sent you?" Lord Ashford said, his voice low and cold, in a way Clara had not heard from him before. The intruder struggled for a moment, then went still, perhaps realizing that stillness was his only chance. He was a thin man, dressed in dark traveling clothes, his face hidden beneath a hood that Lord Ashford tore back with his free hand. Clara did not recognize him, but she saw the same hawk seal from the letter stitched into the collar of his coat. "I was told only to look," the man said, his voice shaking, "to see if the wing was still locked, to see if the child's room was empty." "The child's room," Clara repeated under her breath, and something in Lord Ashford's shoulders tightened at the words. "Who sent you?" he asked again, pressing the blade a fraction closer. "I don't know his name," the man said quickly. "We are paid through a courier. We never see faces, I swear it on my life." Lord Ashford studied him for a long moment, then released him with a shove toward the open doorway. "Leave this house," he said. "Tell whoever sent you that the wing is locked, the room is empty, and it will remain that way. Tell them I am still watching." The man did not need to be told twice. He fled down the hallway and out through a side door that Clara had not even known existed, disappearing into the night without another word. Lord Ashford stood there a moment, breathing hard, his blade still in hand, before he seemed to remember that Clara was standing beside him. "You should not have followed me down here," he said, though there was no real anger in it, only exhaustion. "You should not have let a stranger walk into a locked wing without waking the house," Clara answered, surprising herself with how steady her voice came out. He almost smiled at that, a brief flicker of something warmer crossing his face before it faded again. He looked toward the open door of the west wing, and Clara saw his hand tighten around the frame. "Since you are already here," he said quietly, "and since you have already seen more tonight than I ever meant for you to see, you may as well see the rest." He led her through the doorway, into a hall unlike any she had walked in Ashwood, where the rest of the house was cold and sparse, This hallway was draped in white cloth, over furniture long unused, the air thick with dust, and the particular silence of rooms that had been closed for years. Clara followed him past a room with a small bed still made, toy horses lined along a shelf, a room that could only have belonged to a child. "Whose room is this?" she asked softly. "It was meant to be my son's," he said, and the words landed heavier than anything he had said to her before. "He was never born in this house. His mother did not live long enough to bring him here." Clara did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing, and let him lead her further down the hall to a large room at the very end, where a single portrait hung above a cold fireplace, uncovered while every other piece of furniture wore its shroud of white cloth. Clara stepped closer, and her breath caught. The woman in the portrait was beautiful, in a quiet, serious way, dark-haired, dressed in fine blue silk, with eyes that seemed to follow wherever Clara moved in the room. There was something in the set of her jaw, something proud and unafraid, that reminded Clara of the voice she had heard through the study door on so many nights. "Her name was Marguerite," Lord Ashford said, standing a few steps behind Clara, his eyes fixed on the painting, rather than on her. "She was my wife. She died 3 years ago, along with our son, before he ever drew breath. The men who hunt this house believe I died with them. It is safer, for reasons I cannot fully explain to you yet, if the world continues to believe that." Clara turned to look at him, and for the first time she understood the shape of the loneliness she had heard in his voice through the closed door, the murmuring in the dark that she had mistaken for madness. He had not been speaking to someone who was there. He had been speaking to the portrait, to the wife and the child he had lost, in a wing he could not bring himself to close entirely, no matter how much danger it invited. "Why do men come searching for a room that has been empty for 3 years?" Clara asked gently. Lord Ashford was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes distant, weighing something Clara could not see. "Because there are those who do not believe my son died that night," he said finally. "Because there are those who believe he lives, hidden somewhere they cannot find, and they will not rest until they have searched every room I own, to prove themselves right or wrong." "Is it true?" Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Did he survive?" "No," Lord Ashford said, and something in his voice cracked, just slightly, before he steadied it again. "He did not survive, but grief does not always convince men who profit from doubt. As long as they believe there might be a lost heir, somewhere in this world, they have a reason to search, and a reason to threaten anyone who stands in their way. Including you, now, simply because you carry my meals and know my face." Clara looked back at the portrait of Marguerite, at the proud, unafraid eyes that seemed to watch over the empty nursery even now, and felt something settle in her chest, a resolve she had not expected to find in a locked wing full of grief. She was afraid, yes, more afraid than she had been the night the moneylender's men knocked on her carriage door. But she was not going to run from this house, not when the man behind the mystery had just trusted her with the truest sorrow of his life. "I am not leaving," she said. "Not because I do not understand the danger. Because I do." Lord Ashford turned to look at her fully then, his gray eyes searching her face in the dim light of the cold room, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. Finally, he nodded once, as though some decision had been made between them, without a single word needing to be said aloud. "Then you should know the rest of it," he said. "Not everything, not yet, but enough that you understand why the danger will not end with tonight's intruder, and why it will follow us both far beyond the walls of this house, before it is finished." He led her out of the west wing and back down to his study, where he lit a second lamp and, for the first time, did not ask her to stand in shadow or keep her eyes lowered. He gestured for her to sit, and when she did, he began to speak of things she had not imagined when she accepted a maid's position in a quiet countryside house. He told her that Ashwood was not truly his family home, but a place he had retreated to under a borrowed name, after events in the capital had made it too dangerous for him to remain who he once was. He told her that the men who sought entry to the West Wing did not work for a jealous rival or an old debt, but for powerful figures within the royal court itself. Men who had built their fortunes on the belief that a certain bloodline had ended 3 years ago, and who could not afford for that belief to be wrong. "I am summoned to the capital within the month," he said, "a matter I cannot avoid, tied to lands that were once mine, before I disappeared from that world. I had intended to go alone, and keep this house locked in my absence, but after tonight, I no longer believe leaving you here is safer than bringing you with me." Clara felt a chill move through her that had nothing to do with the cold, steady air. "You want me to come to the capital. I want you safe," he said, "and I have come to believe, foolishly perhaps, that you are safer at my side than left behind in a house that men have already tried to break into twice in 1 week. I will understand if you refuse. I will arrange your protection either way." Clara thought of the moneylender's men in the rain, of the letter with the hawk seal, of the portrait of a woman whose eyes had not stopped watching her since she stepped into that cold, forgotten room. She thought of the loneliness in his voice on the nights he spoke to no one, and the strange, steady kindness that had followed her since her very first day at Ashwood, long before she understood any of its reasons. "I will come with you," she said, "to the capital, and wherever else this leads." Lord Ashford studied her for a long moment, and something in his expression, some careful wall he had kept raised since the moment she arrived, seemed to lower, just slightly, just enough for her to see the man beneath the title, and the grief, and the borrowed name. It was not relief exactly. It was something closer to hope, fragile and unfamiliar, the kind of hope a man allows himself only when he has stopped expecting to feel it at all. "Then we leave within the week," he said quietly. "And Clara, whatever you learn of me between now and then, whatever name you hear whispered in the halls of the palace that does not match the one I have given you here, I ask only that you remember this house, and this room, and know that none of it was a lie." Clara did not yet understand what he meant by those words, but she carried them with her long after she left the study that night, turning them over in her mind, like a puzzle missing its final piece, unaware of how soon, and how completely, she would understand exactly what he had been trying to tell her. The first arrow struck the side of the carriage, before Clara even heard the sound of a bow being drawn. She was thrown sideways, as the horses screamed and reared, the driver shouting something lost in the chaos, and Lord Ashford's arm came around her shoulders, pulling her down against the floor of the carriage, as a second arrow splintered through the wooden frame above their heads. "Stay low," he said, his voice tight but controlled, already reaching for the blade he kept beneath his coat. The carriage lurched forward, as the driver forced the horses into a gallop, but Clara could hear riders closing in from both sides of the forest road, hooves pounding against packed earth, voices calling out commands to one another in the dark. This was no random band of thieves. They moved with purpose, cutting off the road ahead before the carriage could reach the safety of open ground. "They know which carriage to stop," Lord Ashford said grimly, glancing through the small window as the carriage rocked violently beneath them. "Someone told them we were traveling tonight." The carriage jolted hard and tipped, throwing Clara against the door as one of the wheels caught a fallen branch in the road. For a moment the world spun, wood cracking, horses screaming, and then everything went still except for the sound of footsteps surrounding them on every side. Lord Ashford pushed open the door before anyone outside could reach it first, stepping out with his blade drawn, placing himself squarely between Clara and the men closing in from the tree line. There were 5 of them, dressed in plain traveling clothes with no house colors, their faces covered against recognition. "Step aside," one of them said, "and only the woman needs to come with us." "She goes nowhere," Lord Ashford answered, and something in his stance shifted, the careful stillness of a man who had trained for exactly this kind of danger, long before he ever hid himself away in a countryside house. Clara pressed herself against the broken carriage, her heart hammering, watching as the men advanced with the confidence of hired hands, who believed the numbers were in their favor. She had no weapon, nothing but her own 2 hands, and the fear that had carried her through every danger since the night the moneylender's men came knocking. She would not simply stand aside and let them take her. The first man lunged, and Lord Ashford met him, with a speed Clara had not expected, turning the attack aside and driving him back into a second man before either could recover. It was not the fight of a nobleman unfamiliar with violence. It was the fight of someone who had once been trained for war, and Clara understood, watching him move through the chaos with such controlled precision, that everything Mrs. Whitfield had refused to explain about the West Wing was only the smallest piece of a much larger truth. She grabbed a broken piece of the carriage rail from the ground, heavy enough to swing, and when one of the attackers circled around toward her from the side, she struck him hard across the shoulder before he could close the distance. He staggered, cursing, and Clara struck again, driven by a fear that had turned, somewhere in the last few minutes, into something closer to fury. The sound of new horses on the road broke the fight apart before it could finish. A dozen riders in royal colors emerged from the trees, swords already drawn, and the attackers scattered into the darkness rather than face soldiers wearing the crown's own crest. Lord Ashford lowered his blade slowly, breathing hard, and turned to find Clara still gripping the broken rail with both hands, her knuckles white. "You are hurt," he said, closing the distance between them, and taking her face gently in his hands, checking for injury with an urgency that surprised her. "I am well," she said, though her voice shook. "Who were they? Who sent soldiers to find us on this road?" "I did," said a voice from atop one of the horses, and a man in a captain's uniform dismounted, removing his helmet to reveal a weathered, watchful face. "Word reached the capital that your carriage might be a target tonight, my lord. I was sent to see you arrived safely, though it seems I arrived later than I would have liked." "Captain Reeve," Lord Ashford said, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. "You have my gratitude, as always." The captain's eyes moved to Clara with open curiosity, though he said nothing about it, only offering a short bow, before instructing his men to see to the damaged carriage and arrange fresh transport for the remainder of the journey. As the soldiers worked, Lord Ashford drew Clara aside, his voice low. "That was not a robbery," he said. "They wanted you specifically. That means whoever sent that letter to Ashwood already knows you are with me, and already believes you matter enough to be taken." "Why would I matter to them?" Clara asked. "I am no one of importance." "You matter," he said carefully, "because you have seen my face, and because anyone close to me has become a target the men at court can use against me. I should never have brought you into this danger. I am beginning to think I made a mistake." "You did not make a mistake," Clara said firmly, surprising herself with the certainty in her own voice. "I chose to come. Whatever this is, whoever is hunting you, I would rather stand beside you and understand it than sit locked away in a house waiting to be found by men with worse intentions than an honest conversation." Something in his expression eased, though the worry never fully left his eyes for the remainder of the journey. They traveled the rest of the way to the capital surrounded by Captain Reeve's soldiers, and Clara watched the countryside give way slowly to wider roads, busier towns, and finally the towering white walls of the royal city itself, gleaming under a pale morning sun. The palace, when they reached it, was larger than anything Clara had imagined, its halls filled with nobles in fine silk who glanced at her traveling dress with open curiosity before looking away, uninterested in a maid who did not belong among them. She kept close to Lord Ashford as they were led through corridor after corridor, past guards who nodded to him with a familiarity that suggested he was known here under some name, though not one Clara had yet heard spoken aloud. They were given rooms in a quieter wing of the palace, away from the grand halls where court business was conducted, and it was there that Mrs. Whitfield's warnings, and the strange fear in every servant's eyes back at Ashwood, finally began to make a different kind of sense to Clara. This was not simply the home of a reclusive countryside lord. This was a man who had once belonged here, in these very halls, among people who addressed him now with careful, measured respect, as though unsure of exactly how much power he still carried. That evening, as Clara helped arrange his rooms, a servant arrived with a summons written on heavy cream paper, sealed with the mark of the royal court. Lord Ashford read it in silence, his jaw tightening with every line, before folding it and setting it aside without explanation. "What does it say?" Clara asked, unable to hold back the question any longer. "It says I am to appear before the court tomorrow morning," he said, "to answer questions regarding lands that were once mine, and regarding certain rumors that have followed me since I returned to the capital. It seems word travels quickly here, faster even than I expected." "What rumors?" Clara pressed. He looked at her for a long moment, weighing something behind his gray eyes, before he finally answered. "Rumors that a man believed dead for over a decade has been seen walking these halls again," he said quietly, "and that he did not come alone." Clara felt the weight of those words settle over her slowly, though she did not yet understand their full meaning. She only knew, standing in a palace far grander than anything she had known before, surrounded by silk and gold and careful watching eyes, that whatever truth waited for her in the coming days was far larger than a countryside house with a locked wing and a portrait of a woman whose eyes never stopped watching. She did not sleep that night either, though this time it was not fear of intruders that kept her awake. It was the sound of Lord Ashford's voice through the wall between their rooms, low and steady, speaking again to someone who was not there, and the growing certainty in Clara's chest that tomorrow, in the halls of the royal court, she would finally learn exactly who he was speaking to. A hand closed over Clara's mouth before she could scream, dragging her back into a shadowed alcove just as two guards marched past the gallery entrance, their boots echoing against the marble floor. She struggled for half a second before recognizing the grip, and Lord Ashford released her at once, pressing a finger to his lips. "Quiet," he whispered. "They cannot know you were here." Clara's chest heaved as she caught her breath, her mind still spinning from what she had seen only moments before, hanging on the gallery wall above them, framed in gold and lit by morning sun through a high window. She had wandered from her rooms while Lord Ashford prepared for his summons before the court, curious about the palace's quiet corridors, when she found herself standing before a long hall of royal portraits. And there, third from the end, was his face. Younger, dressed in fine court clothes rather than plain wool, but unmistakably the same sharp jaw, the same deep gray eyes, the same faint scar along his cheekbone that she had memorized from countless quiet evenings at his study door. Beneath the portrait, engraved on a small brass plaque, was a name that was not Ashford at all. Prince Aldrich, beloved son, lost to us before his time. "You are a prince," Clara said now, her voice barely a whisper in the shadowed alcove, though the words felt too large for such a quiet space. "They believe you are dead." "They believe what they were told to believe," he said, his voice low and tired, as though he had carried this particular weight for far longer than she had known him. 11 years ago, my father the king died suddenly, and within months, so did I, according to every record kept in this palace. A carriage accident on the northern road, a body too damaged to be shown at the funeral. My uncle wept before the entire court, and took the crown as regent for a nephew who no longer existed. "But you did exist," Clara said. "You are standing here. I am standing here because I survived that carriage, barely, and because the men who arranged the accident believed finishing the task quietly would draw less attention than trying twice," he said. "A physician loyal to my mother's family hid me until I could travel, and I have lived under borrowed names in borrowed houses ever since, waiting for the day I had enough proof and enough strength to reclaim what was taken from me." Clara's mind raced back through every strange detail of the past weeks. The locked West Wing, the fear in Mrs. Whitfield's eyes, the letter with the hawk seal, the attackers on the forest road who wanted her taken rather than killed, as leverage against a man they still feared enough to hunt in secret rather than expose openly. "Your uncle," she said slowly. "He is the one who sent the letter. He is the one who tried to have me taken." "I believe so, Lord Ashford," Prince Aldrich said grimly, "though I have never had proof enough to accuse him openly, not without risking my own exposure before I am ready to face him. That is why I have been summoned before the court today, under my borrowed name, regarding lands that once belonged to my mother's family. I believe he means to test whether the man appearing before the court today is truly who the rumors suggest." "Then do not go," Clara said urgently. "If he suspects, if there is any chance he means you harm inside that court, you cannot simply walk in and confirm it for him." "If I do not go," he said quietly, "the rumors will only grow louder, and he will hunt me with more patience and more resources until he finds proof regardless. I would rather face him on my own terms, today, while I still have the choice of how this begins." Before Clara could argue further, footsteps approached from the far end of the gallery, and Lord Ashford pulled her deeper into the alcove's shadow, his body angled protectively in front of hers. A woman appeared, dressed in fine violet silk, moving with the unhurried confidence of someone who belonged fully to this world of marble halls and golden portraits. She paused before the very portrait Clara had just been studying, tilting her head as though seeing something unexpected in its painted eyes. "Lady Eleanor," Lord Ashford murmured, so quietly only Clara could hear. "My cousin. She was a child when I disappeared, but she was always sharper than the rest of the court gave her credit for." Lady Eleanor lingered a long moment before the portrait, then turned and walked on, disappearing through a far door without ever noticing the two figures pressed into the shadows behind her. Clara let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. "We should return before I am missed," Lord Ashford said. "The summons is within the hour." He led her back through the quieter corridors toward their rooms, and Clara walked beside him in silence, her mind still turning over everything she had learned. A prince believed dead for over a decade, hiding behind a borrowed name in a countryside house, hunted by an uncle who had stolen a crown and would do far worse to keep it. And somewhere in the middle of it all, a maid who had run from one danger, only to find herself standing at the very center of another, far larger than anything she could have imagined when she first read his hiring letter. "Why did you bring me here?" she asked quietly, as they reached the door to her rooms. "You could have left me safely at Ashwood. You could have kept all of this from me entirely." He turned to face her fully, his gray eyes searching hers in the quiet hallway. "Because I have spent 11 years speaking to portraits in empty rooms," he said, "and you are the first person in all that time who looked at me and did not see a title, or a danger, or a burden to be managed. You saw a man alone in a house, and you stayed anyway. I did not want to lose that by leaving you behind." Clara did not have the words to answer him properly, so she said nothing, and he did not seem to need her to. He simply nodded once, as though her silence had told him enough, and left her at her door to prepare for the summons that would decide, one way or another, how the rest of this story would unfold. The court chamber, when Clara was allowed to accompany him as far as its entrance, was a vast hall of white stone and colored glass, filled with nobles arranged in careful rows around a raised platform, where a heavy-set man in a jeweled crown sat waiting. Clara recognized him at once, from the fear that rippled through the crowd as Lord Ashford entered, the Regent King, the uncle who had worn the crown for 11 years, on the belief that no true heir remained to challenge him. Lord Ashford walked the length of the hall with his head high, and Clara watched from the doorway as the regent's expression shifted from polite boredom to something far colder the closer he came. "You appear before us today," the regent said, his voice carrying easily across the silent hall, "regarding a land dispute tied to your mother's estate, Lord Ashford. Though I confess, the resemblance you bear to a portrait in our gallery has become the subject of considerable talk at court." "Resemblances can be misleading, Your Grace," Lord Ashford answered evenly. "I am here only regarding the matter stated in the summons." The regent studied him for a long, tense moment, and Clara held her breath, certain the entire hall could hear the pounding of her own heart. Then the regent smiled, thin and cold, and gestured to a guard standing near the platform. "Then let us settle the matter of resemblance first," he said, "before we trouble ourselves with land. Bring forward the physician who signed the death record 11 years ago. I believe he has something to say regarding the body he examined that night, and whether he ever truly saw the prince's face at all." A murmur swept through the hall, and Clara saw Lord Ashford's shoulders tense, though his expression remained carefully composed. An old man in grey robes was led forward from a side chamber, his hands trembling, his eyes darting nervously toward the regent, before settling, with visible reluctance, on Lord Ashford's face. "Speak plainly," the regent commanded. "Tell the court what you told me privately, only yesterday." The old physician swallowed hard, his gaze flickering once more between the regent and the man standing at the center of the hall, before he finally spoke the words that would change everything that followed. "The body I examined that night," he said, his voice shaking, "was never the prince's at all." The hall erupted into chaos before the physician had even finished speaking. Nobles rising from their seats, voices overlapping in shock and disbelief, and Clara watched from the doorway as the regent's cold smile finally cracked into something far more dangerous. "Guards," the regent said, his voice cutting through the noise. "Seize him, whoever he is, whatever name he hides behind. He has no claim to stand in this hall uninvited." Soldiers moved from the edges of the chamber, and Clara's heart lurched as she watched them close in around Lord Ashford, who stood his ground, with a calm that seemed impossible, given the danger surrounding him. "You may seize me," he said, his voice carrying clearly over the chaos, "but you cannot seize the truth this physician has just spoken, before every noble in this hall. If I am truly dead, Your Grace, then who is it you fear standing before you now?" The regent's face darkened, but before he could answer, Lady Eleanor rose from her seat near the front of the hall, her voice sharp and clear enough to silence the murmuring crowd. "Let him speak," she said. "If he is an impostor, the court will see it plainly enough. But if he is not, uncle, then every soul in this hall deserves to hear why you have kept a physician's testimony hidden for 11 years. The regent's hands curled into fists at his sides, and for a moment Clara feared he would simply order the guards forward regardless of the court's growing unease. Instead, he forced his expression back into something calmer, though his eyes remained hard as flint. "Very well," he said. "Let the impostor prove his claim, if claim he has. Though I warn you, false pretenders to the crown have met far worse fates than embarrassment in this hall." Lord Ashford reached into his coat and withdrew a small, worn object that Clara had never seen before. A signet ring, bearing the royal crest, tied on a leather cord, as though it had been worn hidden beneath clothing for many years, rather than displayed openly on a hand. "My father gave me this ring the winter before he died," he said, holding it up for the hall to see. "It was recorded missing from my body at the funeral, along with several other items the court assumed were lost in the accident. I have carried it every day, since a physician loyal to my mother's family pulled me from a burning carriage and hid me from the men sent to finish what that accident began." He turned toward the trembling physician still standing near the platform. "Tell them," he said gently, "tell them who truly sent you to sign that false record 11 years ago, and why you have carried the weight of that lie every day since." The old man's eyes filled with tears, and he sank slowly to his knees before the assembled court. "It was you, Your Grace," he said, turning to face the regent directly. "You came to me, the very night of the accident, before I had even finished examining the body of the servant boy who died in the prince's place. You told me my family would suffer greatly if I did not sign what you placed before me. I have lived with that lie every day since, waiting for a moment brave enough to speak it aloud. I am grateful, more than I can say, that the moment has finally come." The hall fell into a stunned silence, broken only by the regent's ragged breathing, as every eye in the chamber turned toward him. Clara watched from the doorway, as the man who had ruled the kingdom for 11 years on a foundation of lies suddenly looked smaller than the crown he wore, his composure crumbling beneath the weight of a truth he could no longer control. "This is madness," the regent said, though his voice had lost its earlier authority. "An old man's confused memory, a stolen ring, nothing more. I will not be dethroned by fantasy and theater." "Then explain the letters," Lord Ashford said, his voice steady, even as the chamber held its breath. "Letters sealed with a hawk crest, sent to a countryside house in the north, ordering the removal of a young woman who had done nothing but serve a household staff, believed to be nothing more than a reclusive lord's estate. Explain the men sent to break into a locked wing, searching for a child who never survived his own birth, or the riders who ambushed our carriage on the road to this very capital, seeking to take that same young woman as leverage against a man you claimed did not exist." Clara felt every eye in the hall turn toward her then, standing alone in the doorway, and though her instinct was to shrink back into the shadows, she forced herself to remain still, to meet the regent's furious gaze without flinching. She had run from danger once already in her life, on the night the moneylender's men came for her in the rain. She was not going to run now. "Come forward, Clara," Lord Ashford said gently, and though every part of her wanted to refuse, she walked the length of the hall until she stood beside him, her chin raised despite the pounding of her heart. "Tell them what you found," he said quietly. "Tell them what was written in the letter you brought to me yourself." Clara's voice shook at first, but steadied as she spoke, repeating the words she had memorized from that terrible night in the pantry, the threat against her own life written in a hand that belonged to someone working for the crown itself. As she finished, a fresh wave of murmurs swept through the hall, and Clara saw several nobles turn their gaze toward the regent with open suspicion for the first time. "Bring the courier records from the northern estates," Lady Eleanor said, rising once more, her voice carrying real authority now. "If letters bearing my uncle's household seal were sent to threaten a servant girl in the north, there will be a trail, however carefully hidden. I move that this court suspend the regent's authority pending a full investigation, and recognize the rightful claim of Prince Aldrich until that investigation concludes." The hall broke into fresh commotion, voices rising in support and dissent in equal measure. But Clara saw the moment the tide truly turned, when the captain of the palace guard, the same Captain Reeve who had saved them on the forest road, stepped forward and knelt before Lord Ashford in full view of the entire court. "I served your father faithfully," he said, "and I recognized your face the moment you returned to this city, though I said nothing until I understood which side deserved my loyalty. I offer it to you now, Your Highness, without hesitation." One by one, slowly at first and then with growing speed, other guards and nobles followed the captain's example, until the regent stood nearly alone at the center of a hall that had, only minutes before, belonged entirely to him. His face had gone pale, his earlier fury replaced by something closer to desperation, and Clara watched as he reached suddenly toward his belt, drawing a small blade hidden beneath his robes. "If I fall," he snarled, lunging toward Lord Ashford with a speed that caught the hall off guard, "I will not fall alone." Clara did not think. She moved on instinct alone, throwing herself between the blade and the man she had followed from a quiet countryside house, all the way into the heart of a kingdom's darkest secret, and felt the sharp, burning line of the blade catch her arm instead of its intended target. Lord Ashford's shout tore through the chamber, as guards finally seized the regent from behind, wrestling the blade from his hand before he could strike again. But Clara barely heard any of it over the ringing in her own ears, as she sank against Lord Ashford's chest, her arm bleeding freely down her sleeve. "Clara," he said, his voice cracking with a fear far greater than anything she had heard from him through a locked study door. "Clara, look at me." "I am well," she managed, though the pain made her vision swim at the edges. "It is only my arm. I have had worse from kitchen work." He did not laugh at that, though she had meant it to ease the fear in his eyes. He simply held her steady, as physicians rushed forward from the edges of the hall, and Clara felt herself carried rather than walked from the chamber. The last thing she saw before the pain finally pulled her under being Lord Ashford's face, no longer guarded, no longer hidden behind shadow or half-closed doors, looking down at her with an expression she finally understood, because she recognized it as the same one she carried for him. When Clara woke, she was lying in a bright room, with sunlight pouring through tall windows, her arm bound carefully in clean linen, and Lord Ashford seated beside her bed, looking as though he had not slept at all. "You stayed," she said, her voice still rough with sleep. "I did not know how to do otherwise," he answered simply. "The regent has been taken into custody. Lady Eleanor and the court council are reviewing the physician's testimony alongside the courier records, and it seems the evidence against him grows heavier with every passing hour. It appears, Clara, that I am a prince again, whether I am ready for the title or not." "And what of the girl who bled on the floor of your court, protecting a man she had only known a matter of weeks?" Clara asked, a small, tired smile finding its way to her lips despite everything. Lord Ashford reached for her uninjured hand, holding it gently in both of his own. "That girl," he said, "will never again be asked to stand in shadow, or carry a tray to a closed door, or wonder whether the man behind it sees her as anything more than a servant. I intend to spend whatever years remain to me making certain of that, if she will allow it." Clara felt tears gather at the edges of her eyes, though for the first time since the night the moneylender's men had knocked on her carriage door, they were not tears born of fear. "I will allow it," she whispered. "I would allow nothing less." Outside the tall windows of the palace, the bells of the capital had begun to ring, carrying news through every street and market of a lost prince returned, a false regent unmasked, and a kingdom on the edge of a new beginning it had not expected to see. But inside that quiet, sunlit room, none of it mattered nearly as much to Clara as the steady warmth of the hand holding hers, and the certainty, finally unshaken by fear or danger or secrets kept too long in silence, that whatever came next, she would not face it alone. Smoke curled beneath the kitchen door of the palace's east wing 3 weeks later, and Clara smelled it before anyone raised the alarm, dropping the linens she carried, and running toward the source with her heart already pounding. She threw the door open to find 2 guards struggling against a man in servant's clothes who had set fire to a stack of ledgers near the record archive, ledgers that, she would later learn, held the last remaining proof of the courier payments tied to the former regent. "Someone wanted that evidence gone before the trial," Captain Reeves said grimly, once the fire had been beaten out, and the man dragged away for questioning. "It seems not every loyal hand of the old regime has accepted defeat quietly." Clara found Prince Aldrich in the council chamber an hour later, his face drawn with a tension she had not seen since the night of the ambush on the forest road. He looked up when she entered, and some of the tightness in his shoulders eased, though not all of it. "There are still men in this palace, loyal to my uncle," he said, before she could even ask. "Men who profited from his rule, and stand to lose everything, now that his crimes are laid bare before the court. The fire tonight, was meant to destroy the evidence that condemns him. I fear it will not be their last attempt. Then we will be ready for the next one, Clara said simply, and he studied her for a long moment, before a tired smile finally reached his eyes. The trial itself, held before the full assembly of the court 2 weeks later, lasted 3 days. Clara sat near the front of the hall each time, her arm still healing beneath her sleeve, and listened as witness after witness came forward, some out of guilt long carried in silence, others compelled by evidence too heavy to deny. The physician's testimony stood at the center of it all, alongside courier records that Lady Eleanor herself had helped uncover, tracing the Hawk Seal letters back to a private office within the former regent's own household staff. In the end, the court stripped him of every title and holding he had claimed in his nephew's absence, and sentenced him to exile on a distant northern estate, far from the halls of power he had ruled for 11 stolen years. He said nothing as the verdict was read, his earlier fury long since burned away into something hollow and defeated, and Clara felt no triumph watching him led from the hall, only a quiet relief that the danger hanging over Ashwood and everyone within it had finally, truly ended. The weeks that followed brought changes Clara could hardly have imagined on the night she fled a moneylender's men in the rain. Prince Aldrich was formally recognized before the full court and the wider kingdom, his coronation set for the first days of spring, and Clara found herself swept into a world of fittings and ceremonies and careful lessons in court etiquette that Lady Eleanor, who had become an unexpected and steady friend, insisted upon with good humor and patience. You held a blade rail against armed attackers on a forest road, Lady Eleanor told her one afternoon, adjusting the fall of a gown Clara still felt unsteady wearing. I think you can manage a formal introduction to the Southern Dukes without disgracing yourself. Clara laughed, though a flicker of nervousness remained beneath it. She had not been raised for palace halls or royal titles, and some mornings she still woke expecting to hear Mrs. Whitfield's brisk footsteps outside her door, calling her down to carry a tray to a locked study. But Ashwood had not been abandoned. Prince Aldrich had insisted the house remain exactly as it was, the west wing finally unsealed and aired, sunlight allowed back into rooms that had spent 3 years shrouded in white cloth and silence. I want Marguerite's portrait moved here, to the palace gallery, where she belongs, he told Clara one evening. As they walked together through gardens, Clara had never imagined she would one day be permitted to enter freely. Not to replace what came before, but to honor it properly, in the open, rather than hidden away in grief. I think she would have wanted that. I think she would have wanted you to be happy again, Clara said gently, wherever that happiness came from. He stopped walking and turned to face her fully, the evening light catching the gray of his eyes in a way that made her breath catch, even after everything they had survived together. I did not expect to find it again, he admitted, not after everything I lost. I certainly did not expect to find it in a maid who answered a hiring letter out of desperation and stayed out of stubbornness. I prefer to call it courage, Clara said, smiling despite the warmth rising in her cheeks. Courage, then, he agreed, taking her hand in his. Clara Bennett, you walked into a house full of locked doors and silent portraits, and you never once turned away from what you found there, even when turning away would have been far easier and far safer. I do not intend to let that courage walk out of my life, now that the danger has finally passed. He knelt then, in the quiet garden path beneath the last light of evening, and asked her the question she had not truly allowed herself to hope for since the night he first told her, through a locked study door, that she was safe within his walls. Clara did not need long to answer. She had already given her answer, in truth, the night she chose to stay at Ashwood, rather than accept a year's wages and a quiet departure, and every day since that had only made the choice clearer. The wedding took place in early spring, in the same palace gardens where he had asked her, small and simple by royal standards, exactly as Clara had requested. Mrs. Whitfield traveled from Ashwood to attend, her sharp eyes softened with something close to pride, as she watched Clara walk the garden path in a gown far finer than anything the countryside estate had ever required. Nora came as well, wide-eyed and delighted by the grandeur of a palace she had once only imagined from servants' gossip in the Ashwood kitchen. Standing before the assembled court as Prince Aldrich's wife, Clara thought back often to that first stormy night, the knock on the carriage door, the desperate flight north, toward a house she knew nothing about, and the voice behind a locked study door that had, in time, become the steadiest and most trusted sound in her life. She had come to Ashwood searching only for safety and a way to survive her family's ruin. She had found, instead, a secret larger than she could have imagined, a danger that had tested every ounce of courage she possessed, and a love that had grown quietly in the spaces between fear and trust until it became the truest thing in her entire life. The kingdom settled, in time, into its new era, under a prince long believed lost and now firmly restored, remembered by the court not only for the mystery of his return, but for the quiet maid who had stood beside him through every danger that followed it, refusing, again and again, to look away.